On the 23rd of December 1941, the U-boat U-123 slipped her moorings in Lorient and nosed down the Scorff River toward the sea. Her commander, Reinhard Hardegen, had chosen this departure date deliberately. He did not want to leave on Christmas Eve with homesick men drunk somewhere in a bar. The soldiers of a nearby army battalion had presented the crew with a Christmas tree and a cake. Then came the cheers, the tears, the short speeches, and the strains of Sailing Against England as the boat set off. It was a grand send-off for an old Lorient hand. None of the men yet knew where they were going. The sealed envelope with their orders was still unopened, but Hardegen had a feeling. He had heard about Pearl Harbor, and he knew his big U-boat had the fuel to reach America and come back. The following day, Hardegen took U-123 to 50 meters depth. Down there, the sea was peaceful. The crew celebrated a quiet Christmas, a Christian celebration of the kind Hardegen remembered from his own childhood. He read the Christmas story. The men sang carols. The control room mechanic played his accordion. There were presents from home and a glass of weak punch. Then the boat surfaced and resumed its westward journey. On the 26th of December, beyond the Bay of Biscay, radio contact was made with U-boat command. The order came to open the envelope. Inside was their mission. U-123 was to operate between the St. Lawrence River and Cape Hatteras on the North Carolina coast. Hardegen was to reach his station and await Donitz's final order to strike. He was to carry out no attacks before arriving, except against a 10,000-ton ship, if one appeared. To ensure secrecy, U-boat command had issued no charts of the American coast. Hardegen had only large nautical charts and, remarkably, a Knauer pocket atlas. In that atlas on one page there was a map of New York. That was all he had to navigate by. He had visited New York once before, as a naval cadet in 1933. He had gazed at the skyline from the top of the Empire State Building. Now he would see it from a periscope. The news that they were America-bound broke over the loudspeaker. Some of the crew wondered whether they would come back in one piece. Most were enthusiastic. For the men of U-123, the war was about to enter an extraordinary new phase. They were one of 6 boats selected for this first wave, the boats that would beat the drum on the American coast. Karl Donitz had decided the blow would fall, and it would fall hard. On the 2nd of January 1942, Donitz broke his own orders. He authorized U-123 to search for a Greek steamer drifting some 200 miles east of Newfoundland with a broken rudder. Hardegen arrived in a fog so thick he could barely see. Suddenly, the shadowy outline of the ship emerged ahead. 2 tugs were taking on lines. Hardegen was too close to fire. Then the fog lifted, and he saw 2 Canadian destroyers. He turned immediately. The fog closed in again. The destroyers did not see him. Unknown to Hardegen, the trap he had narrowly escaped was no coincidence. Donitz's instruction to search for the Greek steamer had been intercepted by British codebreakers at Bletchley Park, and the 2 Canadian destroyers had been sent specifically to ambush him. He considered the situation carefully. If he sank the freighter and perhaps one destroyer, the second one remained. It was shallow water. Escape would be almost impossible. His mission was to reach New York. He let the ship go, though he felt very bad about it. The U-boat trap did not close. But it had cost Hardegen 300 miles of precious fuel and several days of time. On the 12th of January, Hardegen found what he was looking for. The British freighter Cyclops came into view, a 9,100-ton target, too tempting to leave, even though it was still some distance from his operational area. 2 torpedoes struck home. The Cyclops went down. All but 2 of her crew of 180 escaped the explosion, but 85 of them would freeze to death in the lifeboats. It was the first beat on Donitz's drum. Hardegen pushed on toward America. On the evening of the 14th of January, he was cruising off Long Island. The coastline was brightly lit. Cars drove along the coastal road at Coney Island. A huge Ferris wheel and roundabouts were visible. Hardegen could smell the woods. The ships were sailing with navigation lights burning. The lightships at Sandy Hook and the Ambrose Light were shining bright. He found his second victim that night, a 9,600-ton German-built tanker, the Norness. He sank her close to shore. No one seemed to notice. Hardegen pushed deeper into the outer reaches of New York Bay. The U-boat moved cautiously in shallow water. He had flooded the forward tanks so that if they ran aground he could blow the tanks and pull free. Only the tower showed above the surface. Fishing boats and tugs passed by, taking no notice. They must have thought U-123 was some kind of motorboat, and then Hardegen looked at the horizon. The sky glowed above New York. You could see the city's light reflected on the clouds. For a week, Hardegen hunted off the American coast at his leisure. The hunting was especially good off Cape Hatteras, where the busy shipping lanes ran close to deep water. On the night of the 19th of January, U-123 had up to 20 steamers in sight at once, all burning their lights. Hardegen sank 3 ships that night. It was really a question of choosing the easiest. Below, in the hull of the U-boat, the crew could hear the muffled crunch of torpedo impacts. The control room mechanic never shouted hurrah like the others. He thought about the people on board the sinking ships the others shouted. He never did. Down below the deck, the desperate SOS calls from the merchant ships went almost unanswered. They did provide valuable intelligence. The radio operator would be sitting below, listening on the 600-meter merchant shipping wavelength. When a ship broadcast its name, the U-boat knew exactly what it had sunk. The closest brush came with a large Norwegian factory whaler, the Cosmos II, which was almost as fast as U-123 and tried to ram her. The Norwegian captain had war experience. He fired his gun from the stern, while the U-boat's gun was forward. For a time, neither could hurt the other. The whaler radioed constantly, in pursuit of submarine. Eventually, the distance opened. U-123 escaped. Nearly 2 hours after the Cosmos II sent her first signal, a Navy aircraft appeared. U-123 dived, and the plane gave up the chase. That was all the anti-submarine defense the crew met during the entire patrol. The American public heard a different story. Hardegen listened to American radio transmissions. Each time he sank a ship, the Americans claimed to have sunk a U-boat. U-123 was supposed to have been sunk 3 times. The Americans needed the consolation, but it was not true. By the end of January 1942, 5 of the 6 drumbeat boats had sunk 23 ships, a total of 150,000 tons. Hardegen's share was 9 ships, more than 50,000 tons. On the journey home, he sank 2 more victims. One of them, the 3,000-ton British freighter Culebra, decided to fight back. The gun battle was brief. A few shells hit U-123, but nothing penetrated the hull. The crew took to the lifeboats. Hardegen approached them, gave them food, fresh water, and a course to Bermuda. Then he continued home. Dönitz was delighted. He sent a typically pithy but warm signal to the boat, to the drumbeater Hardegen. "Bravo, you beat the drum well." When U-123 reached Lorient, the reception committee was embarrassingly large. A boat with propaganda men came out to film them. The second watch officer felt awkward. It was almost like target practice. There was no defense. The steamers had not even been zigzagging. The U-boat commanders who happened to be in port were there. The so-called Blitz maidens, the radio assistants, carried bunches of flowers, and then Dönitz himself came on board. He pinned the Knight's Cross on Hardegen's neck on the deck of the boat. That was the special thing about the whole business. Hardegen had become a hero. The propaganda ministry was grateful for a chance to report a success after so many disappointing months. The German public learned of Hardegen's sightseeing visit to New York. A photograph of Manhattan, reportedly taken from U-123's conning tower, appeared in the press long before the boat had even returned. After hearing Hardegen's report, Dönitz concluded that peacetime conditions would ensure successes for some time to come. The maximum possible effort must be put into attacking the Atlantic coast of America. Boats would be sent as far south as the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. Dönitz's objective was simple: sink more than the Allies could build. Where a ship was sunk was immaterial. The decisive question lay in the race between sinking and new construction. By the beginning of March 1942, Hardegen was ready for his second patrol. As he made for America, he received a radio message from Dönitz granting him freedom of maneuver. Hardegen felt he was Dönitz's favorite because he had made a success of Operation Drumbeat. Nothing was laid down. He had a free hand. He decided to start at Cape Hatteras, where he had stopped on the previous patrol. But things had changed. The Americans had begun to develop defenses. Some ships were sailing without lights. The coast was only brightly lit close to the big seaside resorts. Blimps, small airships, flew about carrying bombs. The Americans had woken up a bit. Hardegen reached the United States and claimed his first 2 victims quickly. On the evening of the 26th of March, a third appeared, a disappointingly small freighter of just 3,000 tons. Hardegen torpedoed her. The crew abandoned ship. The ship did not appear to be sinking. Hardegen moved in with the deck gun to finish her. As he approached, something felt strange. The ship was changing course toward him. How could she do that, with all her crew gone? Suddenly the hatches opened, and she started firing. She was throwing depth charges at U-123. Hardegen veered off at full speed, his diesels smoking heavily. The ship could not see them, but they were hit several times. Midshipman Holzer fell at Hardegen's side, his right leg shot off and hanging ragged. The pressure hull was not damaged, only the superstructure. Holzer died. U-123 had no doctor on board that patrol. Hardegen could only give him morphine and try to make him comfortable. The ship was a U-boat trap, the USS Attic, disguised as a merchantman to lure U-boats into a surface fight. It was her first and last contact with a U-boat. None of her crew survived. Hardegen continued south. On the night of the 7th of April, he found the 8,000-ton tanker Esso Baton Rouge off the Georgia coast. The torpedo hit the engine room. A young American seaman woke on deck to a terrible explosion. The water rushed into the engine room so fast that the ship had already begun to list. He ran uphill, he escaped in a lifeboat, but his best friend was in the engine room and died in the explosion. 2 days later, Hardegen struck again, sinking the tanker Gulf America off Jacksonville. The explosion lit up the sky. The younger brother of the seaman who died stood on the beach with a crowd of tourists and watched the submarine's silhouette in the flames. Tracers flew from the U-boat. He felt a helpless anger. Why would he do that, he thought. The ship was burning, the crew was helpless. What kind of man was this? On the night of the 14th of April 1942, the American destroyer USS Roper surprised U-85 on the surface off the American coast. The Roper opened fire at almost point-blank range. The U-boat's crew was forced into the water. The Roper watched the boat sink by the stern. It was the first U-boat kill in American waters, but the blood was up. The Roper ran in and dropped a pattern of 11 depth charges over the sinking boat, killing all the survivors in the water. A sinking was something to celebrate. It also offered the promise of a greater prize. U-85 was lying in a little over 30 meters of water. Vital intelligence materials that might help the Allies were tantalizingly close. Over the next 3 weeks, United States Navy divers made a number of attempts to enter the U-boat. But the wreck was lying awkwardly, and every effort came to nothing. The intelligence never reached Bletchley Park. By March 1942, total Allied losses in all theaters had reached 273 ships, some 834,000 tons. The lion's share was sunk in American waters. More than a third were tankers, an alarmingly high percentage. Churchill demanded drastic action. Roosevelt privately admitted that the United States Navy had been slack in preparing for this submarine war. But the second happy time was already drawing to a close. By May, the bones of a coastal convoy system were in place. The easy pickings were over. The U-boat would have to find its prey elsewhere. The summer of 1942 brought a shift in the Atlantic War. Dönitz, emboldened by the slaughter off the American coast, ordered his growing U-boat fleet back to the North Atlantic convoy routes. Among the first to answer the call was Eric Top, commander of U-552. The boat, with the famous Red Devil insignia painted on its conning tower. In June, Top and 8 other boats of Group Endras formed a patrol line across the path of homebound convoy HG-84. The convoy was a tempting target, 23 merchant ships protected by just 4 escorts. It was a small screen, but it was aggressive. Captain Johnny Walker's ships had already earned a reputation. Top chased the convoy, broadcasting beacon signals for the other U-boats to home in on. The long June days and the eerie glow of marine phosphorescence made stealth nearly impossible that first night. From a range of 3,000 meters, Top fired 4 torpedoes from his bow tubes and 1 from the stern. Almost at once, a corvette detected him and gave chase, coming so close that Top could make out the details of its bridge. He crash-dived and endured a punishing depth charge attack, but escaped with his boat intact. That night, only U-552 managed to break through the screen, sinking 2 ships. 1 month later, Top was back on station with the boats of Group Wolf, patrolling the waters between Iceland and Greenland. On the morning of the 3rd of August, with just 1 torpedo left and a dense Atlantic fog closing in, the Canadian corvette Sackville suddenly loomed out of the mist at 50 meters, hell-bent on ramming. Her bow slipped past U-552 with barely 5 meters to spare. As Top crash-dived, the corvette opened fire and dropped a pattern of charges. The Sackville later reported sinking a U-boat with 2 Devils on its tower. Top limped back to Saint-Nazaire with his radio smashed, quite alive if badly shaken. That same month, a different kind of shock awaited the U-boat arm. Helmut Whitty, commander of U-159, was homebound after a successful patrol to the Caribbean. Like most captains, he crossed the Bay of Biscay at night to avoid Allied aircraft. On the night of the 13th of July, U-159 was steaming at full speed on the surface when a huge light snapped on from a plane overhead, pinning the boat in a blinding white glare. The aircraft was a Coastal Command bomber fitted with a new weapon, the Leigh Light, a powerful searchlight synchronized with airborne radar. Whitty manned the anti-aircraft gun and fired back as he turned sharply. The plane dropped 3 depth charges that detonated close alongside, smashing batteries and wrecking the interior of the boat. 2 other U-boats were destroyed that same night. For the first time, Allied aircraft had found and attacked U-boats at night with precision. The implications were enormous. Until that summer, U-boat command had no conclusive evidence that the Allies possessed shipborne or airborne radar. The evidence was now impossible to ignore. In response, the Germans rushed into service a French-designed radar detector called Mitox. Its wooden frame aerial, soon nicknamed the Biscay Cross, could pick up Allied radar signals at a distance of 30 miles, buying the U-boat time to dive before an attack developed. The Metox was unwieldy, and its cable had to be threaded through the conning tower hatch every time the boat submerged. But for a few months it offered real protection. The irony was that the Metox itself emitted radiation that Allied aircraft could detect from up to 90 miles away. A year later, the Germans would abandon the device entirely after a captured British pilot planted the false story that Allied planes homed in on the Metox signal. For now, it was the best the U-boat arm had. On the 12th of September, Werner Hartenstein, commander of U-156, sighted a large liner steaming alone 900 miles south of Freetown. She was the Laconia, a former Cunard passenger ship, now carrying 1,800 Italian prisoners of war and more than 900 Allied servicemen and civilians, including 80 women and children. Hartenstein attacked at 8 o'clock that evening, striking the ship with 2 torpedoes. The Laconia began to sink. Italian prisoners cried out from the crowded holds below decks as water poured in. In the chaos, women and children struggled toward the lifeboats. One young mother, Janet Walker, handed her 5-year-old daughter Doreen up to a sailor and climbed down a rope ladder into a boat. The sailor was not there when she looked back. Doreen had been taken to another boat. Hartenstein surfaced amid the wreckage and heard the desperate shouts for help in Italian. He knew his orders: rescue no one. But he could not leave so many to drown. He began pulling survivors aboard U-156, packing them onto the deck until more than 400 men, women and children clung to the submarine. Dönitz agreed to send 2 more U-boats to assist, and Hartenstein broadcast an appeal in English, promising not to attack any ship that came to help. On the 16th of September, an American B-24 Liberator spotted U-156 on the surface, towing 4 lifeboats and bearing a large Red Cross flag. The pilot knew nothing of the Laconia and had been ordered to sink the submarine. He dropped his depth charges, one falling among the lifeboats and hurling survivors into the sea. Hartenstein was forced to cast off the tow lines and dive to escape. Dönitz, furious that his boats had been endangered by a humanitarian gesture, issued a new order. All attempts to rescue the crews of sunken ships would cease forthwith. No food, no water, no assistance. The destruction of enemy ships and their crews was the first object of war. It was called the Laconia Order. Janet Walker was rescued by a Vichy French ship. Days later, for a year, she searched for Doreen among the survivors, refusing to give up hope. Eventually, she learned the truth. A seaman had carried Doreen into a lifeboat that overturned while being lowered. Doreen was among the 1,600 people lost on the Laconia. While the Laconia rescue was unfolding, a very different battle was being fought in a quiet building in Liverpool. The Western Approaches Tactical Unit, known as WATU, had been established at the beginning of 1942 with a single purpose: to train escort commanders in the art of convoy defense. At its heart was the game, a 12-meter square floor on which an imaginary convoy was laid out with model ships. Escort officers sat in curtained booths and made tactical decisions, charting their moves as WRNS moved the models with colored chalk. The game was the creation of Captain Gilbert Roberts, a formidable officer who had personally experienced the disaster of Convoy SC-7 2 years earlier. Roberts devised a series of defensive maneuvers with names like Pineapple and Raspberry, each designed to coordinate the escorts quickly during a night attack. He could be merciless in his debriefings, dressing down even senior officers for tactical sloppiness. By the end of the war, more than 5,000 Allied naval officers had played the game. Parallel to Roberts's work, a team of civilian scientists under Professor Patrick Blackett was applying rigorous statistical analysis to every aspect of anti-submarine warfare. They discovered that the depth charges dropped by Coastal Command aircraft were set to explode at too great a depth to be effective. They recommended new settings and a more powerful explosive, Torpex, which increased the lethal punch by 30%. They also proved that painting an aircraft white underneath made it harder for a U-boat lookout to spot against a grey Atlantic sky. This combination of tactical training and operational research was producing results. The escorts were learning to coordinate their efforts to use radar and HFDF, high-frequency direction finding, together, and to pursue a contact aggressively before returning to the convoy. The number of U-boats destroyed per month was climbing. In the first 3 months of 1943, the Allies would sink 38 U-boats, more than in any previous quarter of the war. The advantage was beginning to tilt. On the 6th of December, Werner Henke's U-515 stalked a veteran liner southeast of the Azores. The Ceramic was an old ship, pressed into war service, carrying nearly 656 souls, crew, passengers, and military personnel. Among them was 20-year-old sapper Erik Munde of the Royal Engineers, bound for the war in Burma. At midday, Henke struck the ship with 3 torpedoes. Munde scrambled down a rope ladder into a lifeboat as fires erupted along the decks. The lifeboats got away, but a storm was building. Through the night and into the next day, the boats were battered by huge Atlantic swells. Munde's boat capsized, and he clung to loose timber. In the cold grey water, he saw something large approaching. It was the U-boat that had sunk them. Henke was searching for the captain of the Ceramic. He found only one prisoner worth taking. Munde was hauled aboard, the only survivor of the 656 who had sailed on the Ceramic. The crew of U-515 treated Munde well, giving him dry clothes and food. 4 days after the sinking, he was allowed on the conning tower and offered a cigarette to mark his 21st birthday. Henke interrogated him repeatedly, trying to confirm that the Ceramic was a troop transport. Munde told the truth. There were only a few soldiers aboard, along with nurses and civilians with children. Henke was not satisfied, but he accepted the answer. Munde remained a prisoner on the U-boat for weeks before being transferred to a German raider and eventually to a POW camp in France. It was months before his family learned he was alive. The British government had told them he was missing, presumed drowned. Goebbels announced his survival on a propaganda broadcast of the 656 people who set out on the Ceramic. Munde was the only one who came home. On the 15th of December 1942, a 19-year-old American sailor named Albert Becker marched up the gangplank of the freighter City of Flint. He was a member of the U.S. Navy Armed Guard, assigned to man the ship's defensive guns. The City of Flint was bound for Gibraltar with a cargo of gasoline, part of the slow convoy UGS-4. From the first day, the weather was brutal. Waves tossed the ships out of formation, and the watch was a constant battle against exhaustion. On the 25th of January 1943, with the convoy far behind and the ship struggling to make the rendezvous, a torpedo from U-575 struck the forward holds. The gasoline exploded instantly, sending a mushroom of flame high into the night. Becker jumped from the blazing deck into a sea covered in burning oil. He managed to reach a lifeboat with a handful of other men, but one boat had capsized, and the rest of the crew were either dead or scattered. The 18-foot lifeboat carried 11 men and rations for 3 weeks. They had no rudder, no radio, and no certainty of rescue. A Norwegian seaman named Romar Johansen rigged a makeshift sail and a tiller. They rationed water by the capful. One man lost his mind in the 2nd week, jumped overboard, and was not seen again. They caught fish with their knives and collected rainwater in the sail. Sharks circled the boat for days at a time. 46 days after the sinking, with 46 scratches marked on the side of the boat, a destroyer appeared on the horizon. It was HMS Quadrant. The survivors were too weak to climb the scramble nets. The British crew had to haul them aboard. Becker's mother had given up hope. When he called her from Chicago, all she could say was, "Oh my God, no, no." He had come back from the dead. The price of that survival was etched into him as permanently as the scratches on the lifeboat. The storm that battered Convoy on 153 on the 16th of December 1942 was one of the worst in living memory. Waves towered like houses, tossing the little corvettes as if they were bathtub toys. On the destroyer HMS Firedrake, ordinary seaman Donald Coombs watched the convoy dance across a boiling, frothing ocean. He had been at sea 8 months and had seen nothing like it. Then came the dull thud that was not the wind. A torpedo from U-211 had found the Firedrake. The ship split in 2. Coombs saw the entire bridge structure lean over and fall into the sea. 168 men went down with the forward half. The survivors clung to the quarterdeck as the storm howled around them. The corvette Sunflower stood by through the night. but the sea was too savage to attempt a rescue. By dawn, the hulk was sinking. Coombs dropped into the water and was washed onto a Carley raft. For 2 hours he drifted alone, certain he would meet his maker. The Sunflower fished him out just before hypothermia claimed him. Only 26 men survived. The loss of the Firedrake showed something new and dangerous. The U-boats were now hunting the escorts themselves, not just the merchant ships. The pack, called Raufbold, had claimed its destroyer, and the Convoy had lost 3 freighters as well. But the remaining escort ships of B7 fought back hard, driving the pack off before it could do more damage. The battle was far from over. Just 10 days later, on Boxing Day 1942, Convoy ONS 154 steamed into a catastrophe. The Admiralty's submarine tracking room, acting on intelligence it believed to be sound, had routed the convoy onto a southwesterly course. It was a disastrous error. The new track led ONS 154 directly across the path of 2 waiting U-boat groups. Contact was made within hours. 20 U-boats fell on the convoy like wolves. The Canadian escorts fought bravely, but were hopelessly outnumbered. Over 4 days and nights, ship after ship went down. 14 freighters were sent to the bottom, and with them 500 merchant seamen. It was the worst convoy disaster since the dark days of 1940. In the submarine tracking room in London, Commander Roger Wynne followed the disaster on his plot. He had warned the Admiralty repeatedly that a typical escort screen of 6 ships could not withstand a large pack attack without air support. ONS 154 was the proof. Wynne wrote in his report that it was a grim demonstration of the convoy system's vulnerability when aircraft were absent. The contrast with another December convoy could not have been starker. Convoy HX-217 had been attacked by a similar pack, but it had something ONS 154 lacked. A very long-range Liberator from Iceland had reached it in the air gap. The pilot was squadron leader Terence Bullock, Coastal Command's leading ace. His crew attacked U-boat after U-boat, sinking one and forcing the others to dive. The convoy lost just 2 ships. Air cover was the difference between survival and slaughter. January 1943 brought a change of command that signaled a new determination. Admiral Max Horton took over Western Approach's command in Liverpool. He was an ex-submariner, tough, ruthless, and utterly dedicated to killing U-boats. He pushed relentlessly for more support groups, better training, and aggressive hunting tactics. If an escort captain was not up to the job, Horton removed him without hesitation. On the other side of the Atlantic, Karl Dönitz was also rising. In the same month, he succeeded Grand Admiral Erich Raeder as Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine. It was a meteoric rise from captain to Commander-in-Chief in just over 3 years. Dönitz promised to continue directing the U-boat war personally. Hitler admired his energy and his unflinching will to win. In London, Winston Churchill convened a new anti-U-boat committee. Its task was to sweep away the obstacles that had hampered the Atlantic battle. The first priority was closing the mid-Atlantic air gap. Churchill pressed Roosevelt for more long-range Liberators. The orders were direct and urgent. The U-boat must be defeated before the invasion of Europe could begin. Horton brought a new energy to Derby House. He understood the value of intelligence and respected Roger Wynne's judgment on one occasion. When Horton questioned the tracking room's assessments, Wynne challenged him to try it himself. Horton stepped into the room, confronted the mass of signals and fixes, and quickly admitted defeat. He left with a cat-like smile and said, "Goodbye, Roger. I leave it to you." March 1943 brought the crisis point. Intelligence from B-Dienst, the German naval code-breaking service, had given Dönitz an exceptionally clear picture of Allied convoy movements. He directed 40 U-boats from 3 packs against homebound convoys, HX-229 and SC-122. The trap was sprung on the 16th of March, 300 miles south of Greenland. The first night, 7 U-boats attacked HX-229 in a howling gale. They sank just 1 tanker, but more boats were racing to the scene. By morning, 22 U-boats were in contact. Over the next 3 days, the combined packs tore into both convoys. 22 ships went down, 146,000 tons of shipping. The Admiralty was shaken. Some began to wonder if the convoy system itself could survive. The propaganda ministry in Berlin crowed about an unprecedented success. The German public heard that 32 ships had been sunk for 186,000 tons. The true figures were lower, but the damage was real enough. In the Admiralty's anti-submarine warfare division, the staff wrote later that there seemed real danger that the enemy would sever the routes uniting Britain with North America. Yet even in this moment of German triumph, the seeds of defeat were visible. Allied aircraft and escorts were sinking U-boats at a record rate. 38 U-boats had been lost in the first 3 months of 1943. Dönitz's exhortations to his commanders grew tetchy and desperate. He accused them of losing their warrior instincts. The losses were beginning to bite. At the end of April, Convoy ONS-5 steamed into the worst of it. 43 elderly ships, most sailing in ballast, were escorted by Commander Peter Gretton's B-7 group. Gretton was a hard man, a demanding leader who drilled his escort captains mercilessly. He had forged his group into a tough, professional unit. They would need every ounce of that training in the days ahead. The convoy was sighted by U-6050 on the 28th of April. The Pack Star began shadowing, and Gretton knew what was coming. Then his fuel ran low. The destroyer Duncan was a fuel guzzler, and all attempts to refuel from the escort tanker had failed in the heavy seas. Gretton made the agonizing decision to leave. Command passed to Lieutenant Commander Robert Sherwood on the frigate Tay. Gretton would later write that he never ceased to regret that decision. Over the next 5 days, the largest concentration of U-boats ever assembled attacked ONS-5. 53 boats from groups Fink and Amsel converged on the slow convoy. The weather was foul, but the U-boats came on relentlessly. On the night of the 5th of May, with visibility down to a few hundred yards, the battle reached its climax. 15 U-boats tried to overwhelm the screen in a single massive assault. The escorts were ready. Radar lit up the fog, showing the U-boats on the surface. High-frequency direction finding pinpointed their radio transmissions. The corvettes Sunflower, Snowflake, and Loosestrife attacked again and again, forcing U-boats to dive and breaking up their attacks. The destroyer Oribi rammed one U-boat, and Snowflake finished off another with gunfire. When dawn broke on the 6th of May, not a single merchant ship had been lost that night. The pack had been defeated. Dönitz had to face the truth. In the first 23 days of May 1943, large U-boat packs had found and attacked 6 out of 7 convoys in the North Atlantic. They had sunk just 6 merchant ships. In return, the Allies had destroyed 15 U-boats in those same convoy battles and another 25 elsewhere. 40 U-boats lost in a single month. It was a frightful total, Dönitz later wrote. A hard and unexpected blow. On the 24th of May, Dönitz accepted the inevitable. He ordered the withdrawal of all U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. In his signal to his officers, he acknowledged the overwhelming technical superiority of the Allies. He promised that newer and sharper weapons would one day allow the U-boat to triumph again. But everyone knew the truth. The Battle of the Atlantic was effectively lost for Germany. The U-boat crews called it Black May. The losses were insupportable. Almost a third of the Atlantic U-boat force had been wiped out in the spring of 1943. Dönitz knew that the balance of advantage in the technical war now rested with the Allies. Until the existing U-boat types could be replaced with new, true submarines with high underwater speed, the losses would only climb higher. Looking back many years later, Dönitz himself acknowledged the true significance of what had happened. Radar, and particularly radar location by aircraft, had to all practical purposes robbed the U-boats of their power to fight on the surface. Wolf-pack operations against convoys in the North Atlantic were no longer possible. He was clear about what it all amounted to. We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic, he wrote. The siege was broken. To signal his resolve, Dönitz summoned the commanders of the Biscay flotillas to a conference with Admiral Hans Rudolf Rosing. He asked each man to speak freely about the terrible situation. One by one they told him what he wanted to hear, that as long as Germany fought, the Navy must fight too. It was a rare moment of consultation, but the outcome was never in doubt. Dönitz later wrote that this meeting confirmed his own conviction, and he presented it as an endorsement by the U-boat arm of his decision to press on regardless of the cost. Morale among U-boat crews plummeted as news of these losses spread through the Biscay bases. The ritual welcomes that had once greeted returning boats were abandoned. In Lorient, a captain cast the customary bouquet into the sea and sailed past the quay without a farewell signal. Allied intelligence reports noted defeatist conversation in the messes, and there were cases of crews deliberately delaying their departure by sabotage. Yet Dönitz insisted the fight continue. He told his men that every boat sent to sea tied up Allied aircraft that would otherwise be bombing German cities. It was a desperate logic, and many commanders accepted it without question. In September 1943, Dönitz ordered a return to the North Atlantic. The 20 boats of Group Luthen carried a new weapon, the Zaunkönig acoustic torpedo designed to home in on the noise of an escort's propellers. Dönitz believed this might tip the balance back in his favor. He sent a message to the pack telling them that the Führer himself was watching every phase of their struggle. The boats were also equipped with additional anti-aircraft armament and a new radar detection set called the Wannsee. Morale among the departing crews was fragile, but there was still a flicker of hope. The Luthern pack made contact with westbound convoys on 202 and ONS 18 on 20 September. The first attack was a success. The frigate HMS Legen was hit by a Zaunkönig and badly damaged. Over the next 4 days, the pack claimed to have sunk between 12 and 15 escorts. Dönitz reported to a delighted Hitler that the new weapons had proved their worth in every respect. He believed the escort screen had been destroyed and 9 merchant ships sunk. For a brief moment, it seemed the U-boat might have found a way back, but the claims were hopelessly optimistic. The true figures were 3 escorts sunk and just 6 merchant ships lost out of 68. The Allies had anticipated an acoustic torpedo and responded within 2 weeks. A simple noise-making device called Foxer was towed behind ships to attract the homing torpedoes away from their propellers. The escort carriers and very long-range aircraft that had been promised after the Casablanca conference were now arriving in numbers. The air gap was closing, and with it any chance of a sustained U-boat campaign. By December 1943, Dönitz was forced to admit defeat again. U-boats had carried out 100 war patrols with the new torpedoes, but sunk just 9 ships. 59 boats had been lost. It was the end of the old-style pack attack. Dönitz later acknowledged that all he could hope for now was a delaying action. The new Electro boats, the Type 21 and 23, were still in development and would not reach the front in time. For the men at sea, the war had become a matter of survival, not victory. The crews knew it, even if their commander-in-chief would not say so. On the 5th of February 1944, U-264 slipped out of Saint-Nazaire on its 5th war patrol. Its commander, Hartwig Lux, was 30 years old and carried the Knight's Cross. His boat was fitted with the Schnorchel, the retractable breathing tube that allowed the diesel engines to run while submerged. It was a fragile advantage. The exhaust plume was visible from the air, and the periscope was nearly blind when the boat ran at depth. Lux had a bad feeling about this patrol. He told his flotilla commander that he did not expect to come back. 2 weeks later, on 19 February, U-264 was detected west of Ireland by the ships of Captain Johnny Walker's 2nd Support Group. Walker was the Royal Navy's most successful U-boat hunter, and his crews were drilled to perfection. The hunt began at midday and lasted 10 hours. Walker coordinated the attack from his ship, HMS Starling, directing a creeping barrage of depth charges that followed the U-boat's every turn. Lux took evasive action, but the charges kept coming, each pattern closer than the last. Inside the pressure hull, the situation grew desperate. Equipment broke away from its mountings. Leaks developed in the ballast tanks. Then a fire broke out in the electric motor room. When a submarine is submerged, a fire is fatal. Lux gave the order to surface. U-264 shot up out of the water like a cork and found itself inside the ring of Walker's ships. The crew abandoned the boat and were picked up by the escorts. Lux clung to the conning tower until the U-boat sank beneath him, then was hauled aboard HMS Woodpecker by a British sailor. The entire crew of U-264 survived. Lux was taken below to the officers' mess, where one of his captors told him it had been a very clever fight. He was less convinced. The Woodpecker was later hit by an acoustic torpedo and sank under tow, but by then Lux had been transferred to another ship. His war was over. Walker's group had sunk 6 U-boats in 27 days, a record that demonstrated how completely the Allies now dominated the Atlantic. The relentless pursuit took its toll entirely. Walker died of a stroke from exhaustion just months later, his own life claimed by the very battle he had helped win. The Schnorkel had not saved U-264, and it would not save any other boat. The collapse of morale in the U-boat arm was not universal, but it was real. On U-154, the commander was a 31-year-old named Oskar Kusch. He was a devout Christian and an excellent officer, but he made no secret of his contempt for the Nazi regime. He told his crew that Hitler was a megalomaniac, that the war was lost, and that U-boat command signals were useless slave driving. He removed the official portrait of Hitler from the boat. His crew trusted him, and no one reported him for months. But the first watch officer on U-154, Ulrich Abel, was a committed National Socialist. He carefully noted every seditious remark Kusch made, and in January 1944 denounced him to the authorities. Kusch was arrested and court-martialed for expressing opinions strongly opposed to the political and military leadership of Germany. The court found him guilty of remarks that bore the character of high treason and sentenced him to death by firing squad. Dönitz was informed of the case but made no attempt to intervene. On the morning of 12 May 1944, Oskar Kusch was shot. He was 31 years old. His crew was told nothing of his fate. The new commander of U-154 was a martinet instructed to restore National Socialist discipline. Heinz Kuhlmann, a diesel mechanic on the boat, was posted ashore before the next patrol and counted himself fortunate. On 2 July 1944, U-154 was sunk off the Azores with all hands. Kuhlmann wept for his comrades. Kusch's execution had been intended as an example, and it demonstrated how far Dönitz had traveled from the commander who once protected his men. Dönitz had nurtured an image of the U-boat arm as a fighting elite, and he expected its members to be the most loyal of the loyal. He had joined the Nazi Party himself in February 1944 and now stood at Hitler's table as a disciple. When he visited the Führer's headquarters, he told his staff that he had seen the light in Hitler's eyes and knew everything would be all right. It was this blind faith that kept the U-boats sailing long after the battle was lost. The sacrifice of men like Hartwig Lux and Oskar Kusch served no purpose but to prolong a war that Germany could no longer win. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the long-expected blow fell. Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. Dönitz had already ordered every available U-boat to attack the invasion fleet. His signal to the crews was a call for sacrifice: press home your attack, even at the cost of your boat. A U-boat that inflicts losses on the invasion forces fulfills its highest mission, even if she herself is destroyed. The U-boats sailed from the Biscay ports, but the channel was a furnace. Allied aircraft swarmed overhead, fighter bombers and long-range patrols that had once been torn from bomber command. Non-Schnorchel boats were caught on the surface and blasted from the water. Those with the Schnorchel survived a little longer, creeping at periscope depth, nearly blind. But the odds were impossible. By autumn of 1944, the Biscay bases were overrun. The U-boats that had once sheltered in bomb-proof pens were gone, sunk or scattered to Norway. The campaign to stop the Allied build-up in Europe had failed utterly. Dönitz logged that the old spirit of the arm had been magnificently displayed, but the truth was beyond spin. 26 U-boats were lost in June alone, for a handful of Allied ships. Hitler's first line of defense had crumbled. The remnants of the fleet withdrew to Norwegian fjords and Baltic ports. On the 18th of April 1945, U-861 glided into Trondheim after a year-long voyage to the Far East. Her commander Jürgen Esten stepped ashore and found walls painted with slogans, "Lieber tot als Sklav," sooner dead than a slave. For him the war was already finished. He spent his first days ashore bailing his crew out of military police cells. In Kiel, Erik Topp prepared for one last patrol. He had been summoned to take command of a new Type 21 electro boat, U-2513. He left harbour on the 1st of May, but the war had only hours left. Topp, like Esten, had been educated to do his duty to the very end. The new U-boat, fast and sleek, saw no action. The electro boats had come too late. Dönitz, now Hitler's successor, faced the inevitable. On the 7th of May, he ordered the unconditional surrender of all German forces. Before the ceasefire took effect, he sent one final message to the U-boat arm. "You have fought like lions. You are laying down your arms after a heroic battle that knows no equal, unbroken and unimpeachable." But the cost was staggering. Of the 859 U-boats that had served on patrol, 648 were lost. More than 28,000 men never came home. The survivors came ashore to silence. The great Biscay pens, once crowded with crews and bunting, stood empty. Dönitz was arrested by American troops and held for trial. At Nuremberg, he was sentenced to 10 years for war crimes, chief among them the Laconia Order. He served his time at Spandau and was released in 1956. Erik Topp, after his surrender, was briefly a prisoner. After the war, he rebuilt his life and later served as an admiral in the new West German Navy. Reinhard Hardegen, the drumbeater, returned to civilian life and became a successful oil trader. Peter Gretton left the Royal Navy and entered politics, eventually becoming a baron. Terence Bullock survived the war as Coastal Command's leading ace and later flew for civilian airlines. Roger Wynn's relentless tracking work earned him a knighthood after the war. Werner Henke, commander of U-515, was captured in 1944 and took his own life rather than face trial for the ceramic sinking. Eric Munday survived the war as a prisoner, and later returned to civilian life as a surveyor. Max Horton was promoted to full admiral and served until his retirement. Richard Amstein returned to civilian life and became an electrician. Louis Scheich survived the war and returned to his job with the railway in Jacksonville. Albert Becker survived his 46-day ordeal in the open boat and eventually returned to civilian life. Helmut Witte went into business and eventually became a personnel manager for an industrial company. Most of the merchant seamen and escort crews faded back into their peacetime trades, carrying memories that would never quite heal. The Battle of the Atlantic was finally over. It had been the longest continuous campaign of the war, fought not on a distant front, but in the grey, indifferent waters that surround the British Isles. The Allies won because they learned faster, built more, and risked everything on the courage of ordinary men in corvettes and freighters. The U-boat had come within a breath of cutting the lifeline, but it was never quite enough. Today, on the Baltic coast at Multenort, a stone memorial stands over the names of the 28,000 U-boat men who died. Their adversaries are remembered too, the 32,000 British merchant seamen and the 50,000 sailors of the Royal Navy who went down in the same cold sea. The Atlantic in the end demanded a terrible price from both sides. It is a story not of triumph alone, but of endurance, of men holding on in open boats and in flooded compartments, waiting for the dawn. Perhaps your family carries a memory of those years, a grandfather who sailed in Convoy, a great-uncle who served on a corvette, or a story passed down from a survivor. We would be honored if you shared it in the comments. We read them, and they help keep this history alive. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this documentary, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your support makes our work possible.